Good afternoon, good morning, or good evening. My name is Drew Burchette. I'm a principal real estate broker in Oregon. I live and work here in Portland, and I wanted to take some time here to go over the residential real estate sales contract. It is a long document, it's 12 pages long. Today is March 22nd, 2023, so they change these forms and contracts every year at the beginning of the year. So usually the changes are pretty minor. So if you're watching this in 2024 or 2028 or whatever, take into account that there might be some changes since then. So it's a 12-page boilerplate contract that is produced by OREF. So it's written by attorneys, and we as realtors basically are just filling in the blanks. So if you have concerns about the fine print or all the details, my standard advice is talk to an attorney and make sure you know what you're signing. So I'm going to go through the contract section by section and just kind of hit the high points here. And then if you're working with me, then we'll actually review any specific questions you have after you watch this video. So I'm going to go through it mostly from the buyer standpoint, but I'll also do it from the seller standpoint as well. There's kind of almost less things to go over for the sellers, so I'll try to hit all of those points. So as a blanket statement, this contract is written pretty strongly in the buyer's favor. The buyer has multiple contingencies, they have multiple ways out of the contract relatively clean, and under most circumstances, you're going to be entitled to your earnest money. From the seller's standpoint, there really is no clean way out of this contract once it's signed and delivered. There's no clean way out without legal action. So if you're the seller and you accept an offer and then 2 days later you decide you don't want to sell your house or you get a better offer in, there's really there's no contingency for the seller to get out of this contract. You can through legal action, but that's definitely over my head, out of my area of expertise. Okay, page 1, section 1, final agency acknowledgement. So I've got my laptop here with the contract on, that's why I'm looking way to the right there. So here we are acknowledging the agency relationships. So it spells out buyer's agent and seller's agent and who's representing who. So in Oregon, it is legal to do dual agency, where one agent represents both buyer and seller in a transaction. As a part of my practice, I don't do that. It probably comes up maybe once every 4 or 5 years where I have to do it for one reason or another. I don't think it's a good practice. I think it's just too ethically compromising. And so if you're a buyer, one of my buyers that wants to write an offer on one of my listings, I'll usually refer that out to another agent that I know and trust. So we're acknowledging who is representing who, and also in here you're acknowledging receipt of the Oregon agency pamphlet, which lays out all of the fiduciary obligations of buyers, agents, and listing agents to their clients. And then we get into the residential real estate sale agreement. So here we're outlining the parties, the names of the buyers, the names of the sellers, the property address, and usually the tax ID number, the county it's in, and things like that. And then down in the lower part, we are laying out the terms of the transaction. So it's going to be sale price, earnest money, loan amount, and deed. So usually earnest money is about 1% of the sale price. There's no hard and fast rule, but 1% is usually what it is. If it's a competitive situation, sometimes that number will go higher than 1%. I usually don't like to ever go above $10,000 for earnest money. The reason being is anything above $10,000, if there's a dispute, it's beyond the realm of small claims court. Anything under $10,000 stays in small claims, so it's an easier thing to deal with if you have a conflict. Plus, most of the time, unless it's getting into the $1.5 million sale, there's no reason to go above $10,000 for earnest money. So this lays out the terms of the transaction. Section 2, fixtures and controls and keys. So anything that is attached to the house is considered a fixture. So this is things like countertops, cabinets, light fixtures, sinks, tubs, things like that. Anything bolted to the house is considered a fixture. So arguably a TV mount could be a fixture. Some permanent artwork that's screwed to the outside of the house, that could be deemed a fixture. So if you're the seller, it's very important. If there's something that's really important to you, like built-in bookshelves that you want to take with you, we have to make sure that those are excluded from the sale. sometimes they will have specific things. The listing sheet will lay out specific things that the seller wants to exclude. So as a buyer's agent, I always make sure that I get those written in. So basically, all fixtures are included in the property in the sale, unless they're specifically excluded. And then the next section, section 3, is personal property. So this would be things like freestanding refrigerators, freestanding ranges. So those things are not included unless they're specifically written in. So this is where we write those things in. And then other times we have things like if you have a bar and there's like bar stools that are specific to that bar, sometimes they'll write in specific pieces of furniture. You know, I try not to get too carried away with personal property in a real estate transaction. It can really muddy the waters. And you know, one of my good friend agents said to me one day, "We're not furniture salespeople." And I have found that putting too much personal property in the transaction can make it a little bit messy. The next section is financing. So the balance of the purchase price is either going to be a loan or cash. This section here is really important, the first one. It's your representation as the buyer of where the funds are coming from. So if those funds are not liquid cash in a bank account that you can write a check for tomorrow, then you really should disclose where they're coming from. So if it's a 401k disbursement, if it's a gift, if it is you're selling stocks, if it's contingent on the sale of another property. So anytime that the money's not coming directly out of your savings account, we need to disclose that. And the reason being is if you're doing, like, for example, if you're getting a gift from your grandparents, if it's not disclosed and then that money does not show up for whatever reason because grandma and grandpa realized that they couldn't give you that money without a big tax hit or something like that, then it really does expose the earnest money. In my opinion, this is the place where you're most likely to have an earnest money dispute if you forget to disclose something here. And then from the seller standpoint, if you see that a buyer is drawing funds from all different sources, you know, in some cases that can be a strike against them. You know, using stock sales as an example. You know, I wrote a contract one time, I remember in 2020, right before COVID hit, and stocks tanked. So my client went from having a whole bunch of money in stocks to having a whole lot less. So anyway, it's really important to disclose those things. If it's an all cash transaction, basically what you need to provide is proof of funds. So proof of funds is pretty simple to get. My best advice is to get a letter from your banking institution, from your financial advisor, saying that the buyer has enough funds to complete this transaction, and then put a dollar amount. Usually you don't want to show, if you're buying a house for $500,000, you want to show $500,000. You don't want to show $1.2 million. It's just not a good practice. So usually a letter from your bank or your attorney or financial planner will do. Sometimes you can just do a screenshot of your bank statement or a bank statement showing that amount, and again, you just don't want to show too much. If it is if you're financing, then we need to show that you're doing what kind of loan. Is it conventional? Is it FHA? Is it VA? And usually you're going to want to attach a pre-approval letter with it. If you don't have a pre-approval letter to attach today, there's a place where you can say that we have 3 business days to attach it. But usually you're going to want to have that. In any competitive situation, you really need to have a pre-approval letter. Okay, we're on to section 5.1. So this is the first of many contingencies for the buyer's favor. So this is the financing contingency. So this section says that the property and the buyer need to qualify for the loan. So if for whatever reason, if you have a pre-approval letter, but that's exactly what it is. It's pre-approved. You don't know if the loan's going to go through until you get way further down the road on underwriting. Most of the time it's fine, but every once in a while something happens. So if for some reason the loan falls through and you're not able to actually get the loan, then you're entitled to your earnest money back under most circumstances. If the property doesn't qualify, then, so that can mean 2 things. One, the appraisal comes in low. So if the appraisal comes in low and we're not able to come up with a way to negotiate a deal, then you're entitled to your earnest money back. if the property doesn't qualify because of condition, so if the roof is failing or there's some sort of a lien on the property that can't be cleaned up and resolved, then the property doesn't qualify. And again, you're entitled to your earnest money back. So getting deeper into this next section, 5.2, failure of financing contingencies. So it gives you a buffer. Usually it's 2 business days to work out an arrangement between the parties. If you can't come to an arrangement, then the transaction is terminated and earnest money is dispersed back to the buyer. Section 5.3, buyer's obligations regarding financing. So a lot of these things you've kind of already done as a buyer, like applied for a loan. You need to complete all the paperwork required for the lender. If there's any material changes in your lending situation, we need to promptly notify the sellers. The appraisal needs to be ordered within, I think by the end of the inspection period, the appraisal needs to be ordered. And the buyer's authorizing the seller or the listing agent to talk to the lender about non-confidential information. So mostly what that means is they call up, say, hey, I'm looking at your pre-approval letter here. I just want to make sure these guys are good to go. Make sure they've been underwritten as far as you can. Make sure you've verified income. Make sure you've pulled credit, things like that. And they are allowed, the lender is allowed to share that information. And you, in this, you're authorizing them to do that. Section 6, seller carried financing rarely applies. It is very complicated to do seller carried financing. I don't think I've ever done one. Usually doesn't apply. Property and casualty insurance. You're going to have to get homeowners insurance on the property. Your lender's going to require it. And if you're buying cash, you want to get it anyway. Very important to have. Flood insurance. Here in Oregon, in Portland, there's a very few areas in town where they're in the flood zone. The problem with it is usually it's going to be, the flood insurance is pretty darn expensive, and it can almost be as much as your taxes. So that can be it can be a deal killer if we find out a property's in a flood zone. Additional provisions. So this is where we're going to write in anything. Additional provisions regarding the loan most of the time. So if we're ordering the appraisal ASAP, if we're doing an appraisal gap filler, we'll put that in here. If there's any closing cost credit that is requested, this is usually where it's going to be. Okay, title insurance. This is in section 9. Now we're getting deep into the contingencies. So title insurance. So there's a big part of our transactions is the escrow company, and I found that we use the terms escrow and title kind of interchangeably. They work under the same roof, but they have 2 very different functions. So the escrow company is the neutral third party that handles all of the signings, they handle all the loan payoffs, they handle all the balance sheets and all that, and they're a very service-oriented business. And they'll be in contact with you for all the signings and things like that. Under the same roof is the title work. So title insurance is something that every lender is going to require, and it basically ensures that there's a clean chain of title down the line and make sure there's no adverse claims. So we want to make sure that the sellers didn't accidentally tell Uncle Jimmy they can have the house and they did a contract that's off the books. So this protects against any of those adverse claims. So as a part of the title insurance process and closing, they are going to generate a title report. So the title report shows if there's any liens on the property, if there's any easements, if there's any CC&Rs or any other things that go with the property. So we have a 5 business day period to review the title report once it comes out. And once that report comes out, if there's something on there that's a deal killer, then you can terminate the transaction and be entitled to your earnest money under most circumstances if it's done within that 5 business day period. So the example I always use is one time we got one and there was an easement running literally underneath the house for a 30-inch sewer main. And so that means that if that sewer main ever failed, then they'd have to excavate under the house, which really made it a deal killer. More commonly, what can come up is CC&Rs on a property. That's conditions, covenants, and restrictions. So some neighborhoods have CC&Rs, and you wouldn't, if it's like a 90s neighborhood, you might not expect it, but they do. So if there's something on there like no boats are allowed in the driveway, or no RVs can be parked, or their chickens aren't allowed, and things like that, sometimes those can be deal killers. So it's really important to make sure you fully review the title report when it comes out. But there is a contingency, so if there's something that is a deal killer on that, you can pull the plug and be entitled to your earnest money back. Section 10, the property inspection. So this is probably one of the more important parts in the contract. It's the biggest contingency that we have. So typically the inspection period is 10 business days, which really translates to 2.5, sometimes 3 weeks, depending on holidays and things like that. So it's a pretty long inspection period. Sometimes in a competitive situation, we'll shorten it to 6, 7 days sometimes. And we can usually get the work done in that time. It definitely puts some pressure on to get it done that quickly. So during the inspection period, there are several main inspections we'll do. The professional inspection. So it's usually an entire morning or an entire afternoon where we hire a contractor to come out and essentially go through all the systems in the house. They go through the attic, the crawl space, they run all of the appliances, they look at the electrical panel, they look at all the systems of the house, and give a very thorough report complete with photos and all that. So professional inspection, sewer scope, they'll run a camera down the sewer line to make sure that it's functioning. Radon test. So radon is a naturally occurring radioactive gas that can accumulate in living spaces. It is a serious health risk, but it also is pretty easy to mitigate. Usually the system that mitigates it's about $1,700. So it's not the end of the world if the radon's high, but it is very important to get it out of the house. So it's something to take seriously. The next one is an oil tank sweep. So there are a lot of abandoned underground oil tanks in Portland. And so we want to do a tank sweep to make sure that there's nothing there underground. In the event that we find one, there is some soil testing that needs to be done, and that will determine whether or not it has leaked. If it hasn't leaked, it's relatively simple to decommission. It's usually it's about $1,000 or so. If it has leaked, and then it's $3,000, $5,000, $7,000. It just depends on how much it's leaked. So those are all things that we'll take care of during the inspection period. There are other testing and things you can do, but any testing that's going to be done needs to be spelled out in this section. So if you're concerned about a certain asbestos tile, we need to spell out that we're going to take a piece of tile to be tested and things like that. So during the inspection period, you have the entire period to do all your testing, inspection, contractor visits, things like that, and negotiate any repairs, credits, or price reductions. So if that deadline comes and goes and you've done nothing, then it's deemed that you've accepted the property in its current condition and we're moving forward. One of my big jobs is to make sure that doesn't happen, make sure that deadline, we're very aware of it, and we're able to submit whatever addendums we need to and negotiate repairs before that time ends. So if we uncover some things in the house that are a deal killer, or if we're unable to effectively negotiate repairs to your satisfaction, then the transaction can be terminated in the inspection period. There's a certain document, the notice of buyer's unconditional disapproval of the property, that needs to be submitted, and it has to be based on an inspection report. So sometimes they're going to ask for the actual reports, and upon request, you are required to, as the buyer, give reports to the seller. But under most circumstances, you're going to be able to terminate the transaction if there's a deal killer in there, and you're going to be entitled to your earnest money back. And there's a section here where you can waive your right to do an inspection. I hardly ever recommend that. There's some different other things with the inspections, but typically going the typical route is the way to go. Section 11 is private sewage system. There's a whole nother set of inspections and testing that we would do for well water, for septic systems and things like that. Doesn't come up in Portland very much, but when you get out in the country, that stuff does come up. Okay, lead-based paint contingency period. This is section 12. So any house that's built pre-1978 has lead-based paint in it. It's just a fact. In fact, I would argue that some houses even newer than that have lead-based paint, because '78 was the year they cut off manufacture of lead-based paint, but they allowed people to sell their stock for several years after that. So even if you have something that's into the early '80s, there's a chance there's lead-based paint in it. So full lead-based paint abatement is really cost prohibitive, and it's something that nobody really does. It's really important to understand the safety aspects when you're dealing with lead-based paint. Really, if you're going to be drilling into any walls, tearing down any drywall, painting the exterior, scraping any paint, you really got to know what you're dealing with, and it's worth testing. So you have, but if you want to buy an old house, it has lead-based paint in it, and either you're okay with that or you're not. So you really need to do your homework to find out if you're okay with it or not. It can affect children and pregnant women. It's pretty bad stuff. But as long as it's encapsulated under a fresh coat of paint, it's mostly, I really hesitate to say the word safe, but as long as you know what's there and you don't cut into it, you're probably going to be fine most of the time. But there is a lead-based paint contingency period where you do receive a disclosure that states if the seller knows about any lead-based paint in the house. They always say no matter what. Sometimes people have tested and they'll disclose that they know something about it, whether they say it or not. If it's pre-'78, it has lead-based paint. So there is how many days? 10 calendar days that you have to terminate. You can terminate based on the lead-based paint, and you'll be entitled to your earnest money. Section 13, the seller's property disclosure statement. So if you're the seller, you fill out this 5 or 7 page questionnaire about all aspects of the house. On that note, as the seller, it's very important to fill it out completely and honestly and over the top, disclosing as much as you feel fit to, because, well, I won't get into the long description of that. It's the one thing that does survive the transaction. So the sale's closed, it's something that if there's a dispute and there's something that you don't disclose, whether on purpose or on accident, and the buyer finds out about it and it's problematic, it can come back to haunt you for sure. So when the property disclosure statement is delivered, you have a 5 business day period to review, and you can basically terminate the transaction for just about any reason, or you don't have to give a reason to terminate the transaction once the disclosures have been delivered. It is the right to revoke period. So even if there's nothing on there, you can terminate the transaction and be entitled to your earnest money back. Sometimes the disclosure statement's got a bunch of good information on there, and sometimes there's just a whole lot of nothing on there. But it is a really important thing to review. And then, like I said, as the seller, it's really important to make sure that you give as complete as a disclosure as humanly possible. Okay, the next section here, condition and components of the property, section 14. These are the seller representations. So this is boilerplate, what the seller is representing about the property. So a lot of this stuff is redundant with the disclosure statement, but as the seller, you want to make sure you read this line by line to make sure that all these statements are accurate. So it says it's on a public sewer system, it's on a public water system, there's no knowledge of hazardous substances in the property, no material defects of the property, and this will be reiterated in the disclosure statement. So anyway, read through all of these, make sure that there's nothing that's incorrect, and then if there are things that are incorrect, we can do an addendum that says, like, for example, I had it come up one time, seller knows of no material discrepancies between the lines of possession, such as fences, hedges, and things like that, and the existing property lines. So I had a client that knew that the fence was over the line by 2 feet, so they made an amendment and disclosed that. So anyway, very important to read through that. This next section is a really important one too, as is, section 15. I'm just going to go ahead and read the whole thing. Except for the seller's agreements and representations in this agreement or in the seller's property disclosure statement, if any, buyer is purchasing the property as is in its present condition and with all defects apparent and not apparent. This provision will not be construed to limit the buyer's right to implied new home warranties, if any, that may otherwise exist in Oregon. So basically, there's no implied repairs. As of writing this contract, there's nothing the seller's required to do. But you still have the ability to negotiate negotiate repairs, negotiate price reductions, and negotiate credits, but there's nothing that's implied in here that the seller has to do. It is an as-is purchase. Sometimes you'll see in my other videos talking about competitive situations and using as-is language. It's really just reiterating what's already in there, but that can be the difference between getting it and not getting it. 16 approved uses. Basically, you have to use the property for what it's approved for. So if it's zone residential, you can't open a barber shop, you can't open a mechanic shop, things like that. Homeowners, this is section 17, homeowners association, town, home, planned community. So if it is one of those things, there's another addendum, there's actually another contract that we use sometimes that has all of the HOA, CC&R information that we're gonna request to be included, and there's contingencies around that as well. But most residential properties in Portland are not part of a HOA, at least close in Portland. Alarm system, if there's an alarm system, you can decide, we can figure out if it's owned or leased. You can assume the lease or not as the buyer. Usually I advise not, those systems, it's a racket, the whole thing. Smoke detectors and carbon monoxide alarms. You've got, as the seller, you have 15 days to make sure that these are installed to state code. Again, this code's always changing, but for smoke detectors, they have to be 10 years or newer. So there's, even if you have detectors, if they're 15 years old, they're not in compliance. And with carbon monoxide alarms, I think it's like 5 years. So anyway, you are contractually required to make sure that you have those units in and that they meet the current code. Smart home features are included usually, and here it lays out whether they're there or not. Wood burning, fireplace, or insert. So this isn't for a gas insert, this is for a wood burning insert or a freestanding, what do you call it? Wood stove. So most of those are going to be required to be removed during the sale transaction, because unless it has an EPA stamp on the back. So I forget what year it is, but like, let's say it's like 95. Anything that's pre-95 definitely does not have the EPA stamp. It needs to be removed. If it's newer, then sometimes it can stay if it has that tag on the back. So removing the insert during the transaction is not that big of a deal. So we just want to make sure we know whether it needs to be removed or not. Home warranties, included or not. This isn't referring to the builder home warranty if it's new construction. There are private companies that provide home warranties. Sometimes the seller will voluntarily buy one. Sometimes the buyer wants to buy one on their own. This is where that's spelled out if it's done. Section 23 is additional provisions. So this is where we put in other specific things, like if it's going to be an as-is purchase, if there's going to be waiver of the appraisal, things like that. Any additional provisions are written in this part. Okay, escrow and closing. So I already spoke a little bit, this is section 24. I already spoke a little bit about escrow and how that relates to title. So the escrow company is usually selected by the listing agent and or the sellers. They'll list a preference in the listing sheet. So usually as a buyer's agent, you're gonna honor that preference. So the escrow company, like I said, they're the ones that handle the earnest money, they handle the loan payoffs and all those things. So this lays out who's doing it. The prorations is either to the closing date or the date the buyer's entitled to possession of the property. So this is for things like taxes, insurance, HOA dues, things like that. The utilities need to stay in the seller's name until closing, and then it's the buyer's responsibility to take those over after closing. The earnest money deposit is usually going to be 3 business days after mutual acceptance, and it's going to be deposited directly with escrow most of the time. Let's see, and then these next couple sections describe the earnest money deposit instructions, the earnest money refund to the buyer, the refund to the seller, and these are all going to go back to the contingencies and how those contingencies are laid out. So, you know, per the contract, there's all these contingencies that I just talked about. In spite of all that, earnest money can always be contested. So if you're the seller, if the transaction gets terminated, there's a termination agreement that we fill out. If both parties sign it, the escrow company is going to do whatever we tell them and disperse the earnest money. If the seller, for instance, refuses to sign, then the escrow company cannot release the earnest money. Even if you have a valid reason to terminate the contract, if the seller refuses to sign, then the title company is going to hold that earnest money until somebody tells them what to do with it. Buyer and seller in agreement. So it can always be contested, even if the sellers don't have a claim on it, if they refuse to release it. And that's where it can get pretty sticky. Closing. So just back to that for a second. So it's very rare that that happens, that the earnest money is contested. And if it does, that's when we bring in principal brokers, we bring in other parties outside of our part of the transaction to try to get it resolved one way or another before it becomes a real bad situation. Okay, closing. So this, with any contract, we have to specify a closing date. So it's usually on or before the closing deadline, and this is section 29, it just spells out the closing date. The closing disclosure, this is something that you'll have to, as the buyer, it will be generated by your lender and has like all of your payments and all those things on there to make sure you understand what your payment's going to be for your loan. The deed will be provided, filed with the county, the change in ownership, that'll all be taken care of by the title and escrow company, and it'll be filed with the county. Possession. So if there's tenants in there, this specifies if the buyer's assuming the tenants or if the seller is responsible for getting them out. If there's no tenants, then possession is usually on 5 p.m. on the day of closing. Or if you end up doing a rent back situation where the sale closes and the seller stays in the house for a determined period of time, then the possession date is determined either as a hard date or a number of days after closing. And there's a whole nother thing to go along with, if there is a rent back situation, there is a form that's called the agreement to occupy after closing. It's kind of like it's not a lease technically, but it's a 4-page document that spells out the terms of that period of time. Oregon state tax withholding. So if you are an out-of-state seller, so if you own real estate in Oregon, but you live in Idaho or California or something, there are tax withholdings that come out of escrow before you get your proceeds. And also FERPTA, which is the if you're not if you're a foreign person, if you're not an American citizen and you're selling real estate, there's a whole other tax withholding thing there. Section 33, 1031 exchange. Most of the time this doesn't apply. So a 1031 exchange, that's a whole nother thing to get into. If you're an investor and you're selling a property and you're exchanging it, this outlines those terms. It doesn't come up that often. Levy of additional property taxes. Again, this one doesn't come up very often either. So this is if you were in tax deferral or something like that, it spells out how those taxes are paid at closing. Okay, historic property designation, again, doesn't come up too often. Section 36, definitions. So this kind of spells out a bunch of the definitions of terms in the contract. Of them, the most important one I think is for timelines as regards to business day. So a lot of the contingencies are based on business days, and the first business day after acceptance is when the clock starts. So if your offer is accepted on Wednesday, then Thursday is the first day of the inspection period, unless there's a holiday or something like that in there. Miscellaneous is a bunch of miscellaneous stuff, as you might imagine. Dispute resolution. This is section 38. So most disputes, if a dispute arises in a real estate transaction, it's mostly handled inside of the real estate transaction, meaning that we don't close until any disputes are resolved. So this really pertains to something that comes up after closing. So if buyer moves in, they've lived there for a year, then they find something that, for instance, that they know the seller knew about that wasn't disclosed, then that would be a dispute that would come up after closing. So this spells out how those are handled. So if it's something under $10,000, it's usually handled in small claims court. More than that, it goes mediation, arbitration, and somewhere in here, I believe it says that you are waiving your right to a jury trial. And I think the point of this is to keep frivolous real estate lawsuits out of the court system, because that could be a mess. So then the last part, offer to purchase. Basically, buyer agrees to buy, seller agrees to sell in the terms laid out in this contract. There is an offer expiration. So every offer has an expiration. So if you're going to respond with an acceptance or a counter, it has to be done before the end of that deadline. But the deadline is kind of arbitrary and can be extended at will with an addendum or as part of a counter offer. So it's really, it is a serious deadline in that the signatures need to be, the paperwork needs to be signed and delivered by the deadline, but if it's not, it can be extended. And then in the lower section here, there's one section to either accept the offer or reject it, or reject and counter. So that is a synopsis of the real estate sales agreement for Oregon 2023. That's kind of just the high points. So like I said, if you're actually working with me and writing an offer, watch this video and then let's talk about your questions and any concerns you have about the fine print. I hope this is helpful.